She was standing in an alley behind Il Tesoro, one of those restaurants where the rich go to remind themselves how rich they are, and she was trying not to cry. Not because she was ashamed. She'd gotten past shame 6 months ago when she'd first slept in her car with Clara buckled in the back seat. No, she was trying not to cry because crying scared her daughter, and Clara had seen enough fear for one childhood. The plan was simple. Wait until the kitchen staff started throwing out the day's waste, ask politely if they had anything edible before it hit the dumpster, take whatever they offered without complaint, and leave. No drama. No scene. Just quiet desperation handled with as much dignity as possible. But timing is everything, and Isabella's timing was terrible. She approached the service window during the dinner rush. Bad moves. The head chef was already stressed, already shouting at his line cooks, already in no mood for interruptions. When Isabella appeared at his window, he looked at her like she was an insect that had flown into his pristine kitchen. She kept her voice low, respectful. "Is there any leftover food I can take for my daughter?" Simple question. Reasonable question. The kind of question that should have gotten a simple answer. Instead, the chef laughed. Actually laughed. Like she'd told a joke. Before we dive in, I pray that everyone who watches this video, subscribes, and leaves a comment will receive the very thing their heart has been searching for, whether it's peace, clarity, healing, or a breakthrough they've been waiting on. May unexpected blessings find you, may your silent prayers be answered, and may goodness follow you wherever you go. Please don't forget to drop a comment and tell me how this story made you feel. Your words encourage me more than you could ever imagine. Now let's begin. Leftover food? He waved his hand at the kitchen like a game show host revealing a prize. "Lady, we don't serve leftovers. Everything that doesn't sell goes straight to the incinerator. This is Il Tesoro, not a homeless shelter. Now move along before you scare the customers." Isabella felt her face burn. She nodded, backing away, mentally calculating how far the next restaurant was and whether they'd have better luck there before Clara got too tired to walk. She didn't notice the man sitting in the corner booth until he stood up. Leonardo Gallo had been having a quiet dinner, or as quiet as dinner gets when you're a mafia boss and half the restaurant knows your face. He'd been reviewing some paperwork, barely paying attention to his food, when he heard Isabella's question float through the dining room. Something about it stopped him cold. Maybe it was the way she'd whispered it, like she was asking for something shameful instead of something human. Maybe it was the chef's casual cruelty, that easy laugh that came from never having been hungry. Or maybe it was the little girl waiting in the alley, the one Leo could just barely see through the service door, standing patient and still in shoes that were 2 sizes too small. Whatever it was, Leo felt something crack open inside his chest, a place he'd kept sealed since his cousin Maria died at 7 years old, because he'd been too busy building an empire to notice she was starving. He stood. The chair scraped. The restaurant went quiet. Leo walked toward the kitchen with the kind of confidence that comes from owning everything you see, and most of what you don't. When he stopped in front of the chef, his shadow fell across Isabella like a wall between her and the world that had just humiliated her. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her. He just spoke to the chef in that quiet, dangerous voice that made men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. "Box up every dish on tonight's specials menu. Send the bill to my table." The chef went pale. "Mr. Gallo, I didn't mean... Now!" And just like that, Isabella's evening went from disaster to surreal. Within 5 minutes, she was holding enough food to feed her and Clara for a week, all packed in containers with Il Tesoro's gold logo, all worth more than her car. Leo spoke one more time, still not looking at her. "Wait by the front entrance." That should have been the end of it. A kind stranger, a generous gesture, a story to tell Clara someday about the night they got lucky. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, more dangerous, and more transformative than Isabella could possibly imagine. Because Leo didn't just give her food that night. He gave her a choice she didn't know she was making. A contract she didn't know she was signing, a war she didn't know she was entering. The leftover food was just the hook. The real story, the one about charity and crime, loyalty and betrayal, feeding the poor while building an empire on blood, That story was just beginning. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of the Gallo Tower, accessible only by a private elevator that required both a keycard and a fingerprint scan. Isabella watched the numbers climb, 47, 48, 49, and felt her stomach drop with each floor that separated her from the street. Clara pressed against her side, eyes wide, one small hand clutching the stuffed rabbit that was her only possession from their previous life. When the doors opened, they stepped into a world that didn't seem real. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the entire city, lights spreading out like fallen stars. The floors were white marble veined with gold. Everything gleamed: the chrome fixtures, the modern art on the walls, the grand piano sitting silent in the corner like a sleeping beast. It was beautiful the way museums are beautiful, meant to be observed, not touched, certainly not lived in. Clara whispered, "Mom, is this heaven?" Isabella's hand tightened on her daughter's shoulder. "No, baby, just different." A man in a dark suit appeared from a side hallway, Marco, Leo's head of security. His face was professionally blank, but his eyes catalogued everything: their worn shoes, their single bag of belongings, the way Isabella positioned herself between him and Clara. He'd seen plenty of people enter this penthouse, very few of them left on their own terms. "Mr. Gallo is waiting in the kitchen," Marco said. "Your quarters are on the 2nd level. You'll have your own suite, bedroom, bathroom, sitting area. The child's room connects to yours." He handed Isabella a keycard. "This opens your floor and the kitchen level only. Nowhere else. Don't lose it." The kitchen was a chef's fantasy, commercial-grade appliances. A walk-in refrigerator the size of her old apartment, knife blocks holding blades that cost more than her car had. Leo stood at the center island, still in his suit jacket despite the late hour, reviewing what looked like a wine inventory on a tablet. He glanced up when they entered. His eyes lingered on Clara for a moment, something unreadable crossing his face, before settling on Isabella. "The rules are simple," he said without preamble. "You don't leave this building without permission. You don't discuss my business with anyone, not the security staff, not the housekeepers, not each other. If you want those conversations to stay private. Assume every room except your bedroom is monitored." He set down the tablet. "In the kitchen, I expect perfection. I eat breakfast at 7, dinner at 8. I don't do lunch. My preferences are in the system: allergies, dislikes, current dietary focuses. Learn them." Isabella nodded, her mind already working, already cataloging exits and routines and the subtle dynamics of power. She'd survived the streets by reading situations quickly. This was just another kind of survival. "Your daughter stays on the residential floor during working hours," Leo continued. "Marco's wife, Teresa, will check on her. She's a former teacher. Clara will be safe." The word safe hung in the air like a promise and a threat. Over the next week, Isabella learned the rhythms of the gilded cage. She cooked and observed. Leo's schedule was precise. Morning espresso at 6:45, meetings in his office with men who spoke in coded language, late-night phone calls in Italian that ended with harsh finality. The security team moved in shifts, their communication happening through earpieces and subtle hand signals. She learned that Marco was the gatekeeper, that the 2 guards stationed by the elevator worked 12-hour rotations, that deliveries only came through the service entrance after being screened by 3 different people. She was good in the kitchen, better than good. Her hands knew food the way musicians know instruments, creating dishes that married technique with the kind of soul that comes from cooking out of necessity before cooking for art. Leo noticed. He rarely praised, but he always finished his plate, and that was praise enough. One evening, while Isabella was plating a simple risotto, she heard Clara's laugh echo from the dining room. She looked through the service window and froze. Leo was sitting across from her daughter, watching her devour a piece of chocolate cake with the kind of fierce joy only children possess. His expression was unguarded, raw with something that looked like pain. When Isabella brought the risotto, Leo spoke without looking up. "I had a cousin once, Maria. She was 7, same as Clara." His voice was flat, recounting facts to keep the emotion at bay. "I was building this empire, taking territory, making deals, too busy to notice she was sick, too focused to see she was starving because her mother spent the grocery money on drugs. He finally met Isabella's eyes. By the time I paid attention, she was in the hospital. 3 days later, she was gone. Clara, oblivious, continued eating her cake. "I'm not saving you," Leo said quietly. "Or her. I'm controlling what happens inside my walls. That's all this is. Control." But Isabella saw the lie in his eyes, the way they kept drifting back to Clara's smile. She understood then that she and her daughter weren't just employees, they were ghosts he was trying to exorcise, phantoms of a guilt that had shaped everything he'd become. The cage was gilded, yes, but it was still a cage, and Isabella was beginning to realize the bars were built as much to keep Leo's demons in as to keep the world out. The routine settled over them like snow, quiet, insulating, deceptively peaceful. 3 weeks into their new life, Clara had stopped flinching at sudden noises and started treating the penthouse like the home it was never meant to be. She'd discovered that Leo took his evening espresso at exactly 9 o'clock, and she'd begun timing her bedtime routine to intercept him in the hallway, armed with questions that seemed designed to dismantle his carefully constructed walls. "Why do you have tattoos if you always wear suits?" she asked one night, catching him outside his office. She'd seen the dark ink peeking from his collar once, serpentine patterns that disappeared beneath expensive fabric. Leo paused, his hand on the door handle. Isabella, clearing dishes from the dining room, watched the exchange with held breath. "They're reminders," he said finally. "Of what?" "Where I came from, so I don't forget." Clara tilted her head, considering this with the seriousness only children can muster. "Mom says forgetting bad things is okay sometimes. She says remembering too much makes you sad." Something flickered across Leo's face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Your mother is very wise. Then why don't you listen to her?" Leo almost smiled. Almost. "Because some of us don't deserve to forget." Isabella saw it then, the hairline fracture in his armor. Clara's questions weren't an annoyance to him, they were an excavation, unearthing parts of himself he'd buried under violence and control. He answered her honestly in ways he'd never answer adults, as if her innocence granted her diplomatic immunity from his usual defenses. The next day, Marco summoned Isabella to the kitchen with unusual formality. Leo stood by the wine cellar entrance, the heavy steel door propped open to reveal temperature-controlled darkness beyond. "The inventory system crashed last week," Leo said without preamble. "Insurance requires a manual count, every bottle, vintage, condition. It's tedious work, but necessary." He handed her a tablet and a penlight. "Take your time. Some of these bottles are worth more than cars. Handle them accordingly." Isabella descended the stairs into cold, hushed silence. The cellar was vast, row upon row of dark glass cradled in custom wooden racks. The air tasted of oak and thyme. She began the count, scanning labels in French and Italian, logging serial numbers for wines she'd never be able to afford to taste. She was 3 hours in when she heard Marco's voice filter down from the kitchen above, sharp with tension. "Vecchio's made another move. Bought out the distributor on 5th. Leo's response was too quiet to hear, but Marco's reply carried clearly. "He's circling closer. Every week, another piece off the board. We need to." The conversation faded as they moved away. But the name hung in the air like cordite. Vecchio. Isabella had heard it whispered by the security team, always with the same undercurrent of dread. Whoever Vecchio was, he made dangerous men nervous. She continued counting, but now she was listening, alert to every sound from above. Footsteps, door closings, the low murmur of voices conducting business in coded language. The wine cellar felt less like a storage room and more like a confessional, secrets seeping through the floor above. Near the back wall, behind a rack of 1995 Bordeaux, Isabella noticed something odd. The wooden paneling didn't quite align, a shadow-thin gap running vertically where the seams should be flush. She pressed experimentally, and the panel shifted. Not much, just a millimeter, but enough to confirm it wasn't solid wall. Her pulse quickened. She glanced at the stairs, listening, No footsteps, no voices. She pressed harder. The panel gave way with a whisper of hydraulics, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. Not a wine cellar, something else, something hidden. Isabella stood at the threshold, penlight in hand, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to finish the inventory, to stay in her lane and keep Clara safe by staying ignorant. But she'd survived the streets by understanding her environment, by knowing the dangers before they found her. This penthouse was beautiful and cold and ruled by a man whose kindness came wrapped in control. If she was going to keep Clara truly safe, she needed to know what she was really living inside. She descended 3 steps. 5. The temperature dropped. The walls changed from finished wood to bare concrete. At the bottom, a steel door stood slightly ajar, blue light leaking through the gap, the glow of active monitors, of systems running in secret. Isabella heard her daughter's laugh echo from somewhere far above, innocent and bright. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, windowless, and humming with technology. Servers, monitors, file cabinets with biometric locks. One wall was covered in photographs, faces she didn't recognize. Locations marked with red string, connecting one image to another like a spider's web of conspiracy. And there, in the center of the conspiracy board, was a photograph of an older man with cold eyes and a crueler smile. Written beneath in sharp, angry handwriting. Don Marco Vecchio. Threat level. Immediate. Isabella's hand tightened on the penlight. She'd found Leo's secrets. And secrets, she was beginning to understand, were far more dangerous than poverty had ever been. Isabella waited 3 days before returning to the hidden room. 3 days of cooking perfectly seasoned meals while her mind catalogued security patterns. 3 days of watching Marco's team rotate shifts, noting the 6-minute gap at 2 p.m. when the guards changed and the surveillance monitors rebooted. 3 days of pretending she hadn't seen the conspiracy board, the server racks, the name Vecchio burning in her memory like a brand. On the 4th day, while Leo was in a meeting behind his office's soundproof doors and Clara was absorbed in a puzzle with Teresa upstairs, Isabella descended into the wine cellar with her tablet and her practiced excuse. She moved quickly past the expensive bottles to the hidden panel, slipping through before doubt could paralyze her. The stairwell swallowed her into cold darkness. At the bottom, the steel door stood closed this time, but unlocked. An oversight, or perhaps arrogance. Men like Leo didn't expect people to look for doors they didn't know existed. Inside, the monitors cast their blue glow across surfaces that hummed with purpose. Isabella moved to the nearest filing cabinet, her hands steadier than they should have been. The first drawer opened with a quiet click. Inside were ledgers, not digital files, but physical books, the kind kept when you didn't want any electronic trail leading back to you. She pulled one out, flipping it open under the penlight's beam. The entries were coded, abbreviations and numbers that meant nothing at first glance. But Isabella had worked restaurant books before, back when she'd had a life that included legitimate employment. She recognized the structure: expenses, allocations, transfers. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands moving monthly, sometimes weekly, but the coding was wrong for criminal enterprise. No drugs, no weapons, no protection rackets. Instead, SOL K7, $47,000. SOL M3, $89,000. SOL D12, $125,000. Every entry marked with the same prefix, Sol. She flipped back to the cover page. There, in neat handwriting, Project Solace, Fiscal Year Operations. Solace. The word felt significant, though she couldn't explain why. She photographed several pages with shaking hands, the tablet's camera shutter clicking softly in the silence. The second filing cabinet held something worse: surveillance photographs. She spread them across the desk, dozens of images tracking one man through various locations. Restaurants, warehouses, a funeral, a wedding. The subject was maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of face that had forgotten how to smile without calculation. His eyes were dead things, cold and evaluative, even in candid shots. Clipped to the photos were printed dossiers. Isabella read quickly, her pulse hammering. Don Marco Vecchio, former mentor, current threat. Motive, territorial expansion plus personal vendetta. Assets, political connections, law enforcement contacts, 3 confirmed crews. Known activity, systematic acquisition of Gallo distribution networks. Threat assessment, immediate and escalating. Beneath that, in Leo's handwriting, he's not trying to kill me. He's trying to destroy everything I've built. Isabella's breath caught. This wasn't gang warfare. This was something more surgical, more personal. Vecchio was dismantling Leo's empire piece by piece, turning allies into enemies, buying loyalty that should have been unshakable. And if Leo fell, what happened to the people living in his penthouse? What happened to a woman and child who'd seen too much, who knew where the hidden doors led? She was still processing this when she found the 3rd file. It was thinner, marked with a red tab. Operational vulnerabilities. Inside was a security assessment dated 2 weeks ago. Her hands went numb as she read her own name. Isabella Moretti, hired staff. Unsecured background. Potential leverage point. Recommendation. Monitor for external contact. Risk level, moderate. Moderate. She was a moderate risk, a vulnerability, a crack in Leo's armor that Vecchio could exploit if he discovered her existence. Clara's face flashed through her mind, her daughter upstairs playing puzzles, believing they were finally safe. But safety was an illusion here. They weren't guests in Leo's fortress. They were hostages he'd chosen to keep comfortable, pieces on a board in a game she was only beginning to understand. Isabella photographed the vulnerability assessment, then carefully returned everything to its place. Her hands moved mechanically, but her mind was racing through scenarios, calculating the odds of escape versus the odds of survival if she stayed. She was halfway up the stairwell when she heard it. Footsteps in the wine cellar above. Heavy, deliberate, not hurried, but purposeful. Marco's voice carried down. Mr. Gallo wanted me to check on the inventory progress. Isabella froze, one hand on the steel door she'd just closed. If he descended those stairs, if he found her here instead of cataloging wine. She forced herself to move, climbing quickly, emerging from behind the Bordeaux rack just as Marco reached the bottom of the cellar stairs. She looked up, tablet in hand, playing the role she'd been cast in. Almost finished, she said, her voice remarkably steady. The 2009 section had some discrepancies. I'm double-checking. Marco studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. Mr. Gallo says take your time. Accuracy matters more than speed. He left. Isabella waited until his footsteps faded completely before she let herself breathe. She'd found Leo's secrets, massive, coded expenses flowing towards something called solace, a war with a man who wanted to destroy him, and her own name on a list of vulnerabilities. The cage wasn't just gilded anymore, it was a trap, and she'd just discovered she was bait. Isabella had watched Marco enter his password 3 times during the past week, standing innocently in the hallway with cleaning supplies, her eyes tracking his thick fingers as they moved across the keypad mounted outside Leo's office. 8 digits. She'd memorized the pattern, the rhythm, the slight hesitation before the final 2 numbers. Muscle memory translated to knowledge, and knowledge was the only currency that mattered now. She returned to the surveillance room during the morning shift change, her window of safety narrower each time she descended those hidden stairs. The servers hummed their constant song, blue light washing over her hands as she approached the secure terminal. She entered Marco's code, 471983326, and held her breath. The screen unlocked. The directory was organized with military precision, folders labeled by date and operation code. Near the top sat one marked simply, Solace, Master File. Isabella's finger trembled as she clicked it open. What unfolded across the screen wasn't ledgers or surveillance reports. It was blueprints, dozens of them, warehouse conversions, commercial kitchen layouts, shelter floor plans, addresses scattered across the city's poorest neighborhoods, the South Side, the Factory District, the Riverside slums where Isabella had spent 6 months living in her car. She scrolled through operational documents, food supply chains, volunteer schedules, medical clinic hours. There were photographs of massive industrial kitchens serving lines of people that stretched around blocks. Families, children, the elderly, the kind of faces Isabella had seen in every mirror during her worst months, exhausted, desperate, but fed. Her hands shook as she opened a financial summary. The numbers from the coded ledgers suddenly made terrible, beautiful sense. SOL K7, Downtown Charity Kitchen, monthly operating cost $47,000. SOL M3, Southside Medical and Food Hub, monthly operating cost $89,000. SOL D12, Riverside Family Shelter and Kitchen, monthly operating cost $125,000. 12 locations total. Over $1 million monthly, all flowing from Leo's criminal empire into the city's most vulnerable neighborhoods. The network fed an estimated 3,000 people daily. The same people Isabella and Clara would have become if Leo hadn't intervened that night at Il Tesoro. The leftover food she'd begged for, the scraps she'd been willing to accept like a dog under the table, had never been scraps at all. It was surplus, carefully calculated and distributed through a network so vast and efficient it functioned like a shadow government, filling gaps the actual government had abandoned. Leo wasn't just a crime lord, he was the architect of mercy, building salvation with blood money. Isabella scrolled deeper, her stomach tightening as she found a subfolder marked Vecchio, Threat Assessment, Updated. The document inside was dated 3 days ago. She read with mounting horror. Intelligence confirms Vecchio's primary target is not territorial acquisition, but reputational destruction. Plan: infiltrate Sol D12, Riverside location, during monthly mass feeding event scheduled for Dec 15th. Plant explosives. Detonate during peak attendance, estimate 101,000 civilians. Leak Leo Gallo's financial connection to media simultaneously. Outcome: mass casualties blamed on Mafia charity expose Gallo as fraud who endangered the people he claimed to protect. Public opinion turns, political protection evaporates. Empire collapses without firing a shot. The date at the bottom made her blood freeze. Event date, 6 days. Isabella stared at the screen, her mind reeling. Vecchio wasn't just attacking Leo, he was weaponizing compassion, turning the one good thing Leo had built into the instrument of his destruction. 800 to 1,000 people, families like hers, would die to prove a point. To win a war, children would die. Clara's age, younger. She downloaded the file onto a thumb drive she'd stolen from the kitchen office, then kept searching. She found construction manifests, supply invoices, volunteer background checks. Everything was meticulously documented, protected, monitored. Leo had built this network with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his criminal operations. The final folder contained photographs from the charity kitchens, candid shots of people being served. Isabella clicked through them, and her breath caught. There, in a photo from 8 months ago at the Southside location, was a woman holding a little girl's hand. The woman's face was thinner, harder, but unmistakable. It was Isabella and Clara, standing in line for food at one of Leo's kitchens. They'd been saved by Project Solace before they ever met Leo, before Il Tesoro, before any of this. The network had kept them alive during their worst months, and Isabella had never known who funded it, never questioned the miracle of free food and shelter when she'd lost everything else. Leo hadn't just saved them that night at the restaurant, he'd been saving them for months, invisibly, asking nothing in return, until now. Isabella closed the files and erased her access log, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that hesitation meant death. She climbed back through the hidden passages, emerged in the wine cellar, and stood among the expensive bottles that represented everything this place pretended to be. Wealth, power, exclusivity. But beneath it all, in the hidden spaces, was something else. Something that fed thousands, while the world above dined on truffle and indifference. She couldn't run anymore. Couldn't take Clara and disappear into another city, another struggle, another desperate search for safety. Because if Leo fell, if Vecchio succeeded, the entire network would collapse. 3,000 people would lose their lifeline, families would go hungry, children would suffer, and 800 people would die in 6 days if she did nothing. Isabella had spent months learning to survive by staying invisible, by avoiding conflict, by taking the safe path. That woman was gone. She climbed the stairs with the thumb drive burning in her pocket, carrying the weight of knowledge that transformed her from victim to soldier in a war she'd never chosen but could no longer ignore. The lockdown began at 4 a.m. without warning. Isabella woke to the sound of heavy boots in the hallway, voices sharp with urgency, and the mechanical hum of steel shutters descending over every window. She grabbed Clara, pulling her daughter close as darkness swallowed the penthouse, transforming their gilded cage into something that felt like a tomb. "Mom?" Clara's voice was small, frightened in a way it hadn't been since their first night on the streets. "It's okay, baby. Just stay quiet." But it wasn't okay. Isabella heard Marco barking orders, heard the distinctive metallic snap of weapons being checked and loaded. She heard Leo's voice, calm and cold as winter, issuing commands in Italian. The apartment had become a fortress preparing for siege. At dawn, Marco appeared at their door, his face grim. "You're confined to your suite until further notice. No exceptions. Meals will be brought to you." "What's happening?" Isabella asked. Though she already knew, the files, the intelligence. Vecchio was making his move. "Security protocol," Marco said, his hand resting on his weapon. "Mr. Gallo's orders." The door closed, the lock engaged with a definitive click that hadn't been there before. Isabella stood in the center of their suddenly too small living space, her mind racing. The server access, she'd been careful, erased her tracks, covered every digital footprint. But sophisticated systems had sophisticated safeguards. Somewhere in Leo's security architecture, an alert had been triggered. A flag raised. Someone had been in places they shouldn't have been. Leo knew. He had to know. The question wasn't whether he'd discovered her intrusion. The question was why he hadn't acted yet. Why she was locked in her room instead of being interrogated by Marco or worse. Either he was waiting for the immediate crisis to pass before dealing with her betrayal, or he was testing her, waiting to see what she'd do with the knowledge she'd stolen. Hours crawled past. Clara sensed the tension, growing quiet and clingy in that way children do when the adults around them are afraid. Isabella held her, stroked her hair, and listened to the fragments of conversation filtering through the ventilation system. At 3 p.m., she heard Leo's voice clearly, echoing from his office below. 48 hours, that's all we have." Marco's response was muffled, but Leo's reply carried perfectly. "Vecchio's people are already embedded. They look like volunteers, blend in with the staff. We can't shut down the operation without triggering suspicion, and if we trigger suspicion, they'll move the timeline up." A pause. "We need someone who knows those streets, knows how those kitchens actually function, someone who's been on the other side." The implication hung heavy in the filtered air. Leo needed street knowledge, the kind of intelligence that couldn't be gained from surveillance or paid informants. He needed someone who'd lived in the places Project Solace served, who understood the rhythms and patterns of survival in those neighborhoods. He needed someone like Isabella. She stood, pacing the suite like a caged animal. The thumb drive was hidden in Clara's stuffed rabbit. The evidence of her espionage literally clutched in her daughter's arms. She could stay silent, wait out the crisis behind locked doors, hope that Leo's people stopped Vecchio without her involvement. Keep her head down, stay safe. But 800 people would be in that kitchen in 48 hours. Families, children, people who looked like Clara, who'd stood in lines like she had, who depended on the miracle of free food because every other safety net had failed them. And she had information Leo needed. Not just the files she'd stolen, but something more valuable. She'd been one of them. She knew how the kitchens worked from the inside, knew the volunteer patterns, the entry points, the places where security was light because desperation couldn't afford to be suspicious. She knew where someone could hide a bomb. The decision crystallized like ice forming over still water. Beautiful, dangerous, irreversible. Isabella walked to the locked door and knocked, hard and insistent. When Marco's voice came through the intercom, she spoke clearly, without hesitation. "I need to speak to Leo, now. Tell him I know about Project Solace. Tell him I know about Vecchio's plan, and tell him I can help." Silence. Then, "Stay there." 10 minutes later, the lock disengaged. Marco stood in the doorway, his weapon visible now, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Gallo will see you in his office. The child stays here with Teresa." Isabella kissed Clara's forehead, breathing in the scent of her daughter's hair like it might be the last time. "Be good for Teresa, okay? Are you coming back?" Clara's eyes were too knowing, too aware that sometimes people left and didn't return. "Always," Isabella lied, and hoped it would become truth. She followed Marco through the tense, watchful penthouse toward Leo's office, carrying her confession like a grenade with the pin already pulled. In 48 hours, hundreds would die unless she could convince a mafia boss to trust the woman who'd been spying on him. The odds weren't good, but they were the only odds that mattered. Leo's office was dark except for the city lights bleeding through the armored glass. He stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, a silhouette against the sprawl of lights that represented his empire. Marco closed the door behind Isabella with the finality of a vault ceiling. "You accessed the secure server 4 days ago," Leo said without turning. His voice was conversational, almost gentle. That made it more terrifying. "The system logged an unauthorized entry at 2:14 p.m. Marco's password, correctly entered. Very clever." Isabella's throat went dry, but she forced herself to speak. "Then you know I've seen everything. The ledgers. The network. Vecchio's plan. I know you've been in places that get people killed." He turned then, and his face was unreadable, not angry, not merciful, just calculating. "The question is, what you intend to do with that information." "The question," Isabella said, her voice harder than she expected, "is what you intend to do with my daughter when Vecchio's bombs go off in 2 days." She pulled the thumb drive from her pocket and set it on his desk. "You're using your crime money to feed the city, and I'm grateful. Clara and I ate at your Southside kitchen for 3 months before you ever bought us dinner at Il Tesoro, but you're also bringing war to my daughter's door. So before you decide whether to kill me for snooping, tell me how you plan to keep her safe when 800 people die and your empire burns." Leo stared at her for a long moment, something like respect flickering in his eyes. He moved to his desk, picked up the thumb drive, and set it aside without looking at it. "Sit down, Isabella." "I'd rather stand." "Sit down." She sat. Leo poured 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter, slid one across the desk to her, and took his own seat. The gun on his hip was visible now, a reminder of what he was beneath the custom suits. "Project Solace feeds 3,000 people daily," he said quietly. "It costs me over $1 million a month. Every dollar comes from enterprises the government calls criminal, protection, gambling, loans, shipping contracts that aren't entirely legal. The politicians won't fund these programs because there's no profit in feeding the poor. The charities can't scale without money they don't have, so I do it. With blood money," Isabella said. "With the only money that works." He leaned forward. "You think I haven't tried legitimate channels? I've offered to fund these programs through proper nonprofits. But legitimate money comes with oversight, audits, questions about where a man like me gets millions to donate. It comes with politicians who want to attach their names to my generosity, then shut me down when it's convenient. The system doesn't want to feed these people, Isabella. It wants them desperate and dependent. So you play God instead." "I keep them alive." His voice hardened. "Maria starved because I was too proud to steal food for her. Too focused on building power the right way. I won't make that mistake again. If crime money is the only money that feeds the city, then I'll be a criminal. At least 3,000 people eat. Isabella gripped her glass. And Vecchio wants to destroy it. Vecchio wants to destroy me. The network is just the most efficient weapon. Leo pulled a file from his drawer and spread photographs across the desk. Surveillance images of men in volunteer vests, carrying supplies into the riverside kitchen. These 4 are his people. Confirmed. We think there are 2 more we haven't identified. They'll plant the devices during tomorrow's prep shift, detonate during the Friday evening service when attendance peaks, then shut it down, cancel the service. If we shut down, they'll know we're onto them. They'll move the attack forward, hit a smaller location with less security, or worse, hit multiple sites simultaneously. We can't stop what we can't see coming. He met her eyes. But you've been one of them. You know how those kitchens work from the inside, where volunteers go, where supplies are stored, how the flow operates. You know things my surveillance can't see. Isabella looked at the photographs, at the faces of men who would murder hundreds to win a war. You want me to help you identify them. I want you to help me stop them. He slid a final document across the desk. Intelligence reports, movement patterns, Vecchio's known tactics. In 48 hours, hundreds of people die, or Project Solace dies, or Vecchio dies. Those are the only outcomes. You can walk away right now, take Clara, and I'll have Marco drive you anywhere you want. You'll never hear from me again. And the kitchen? I'll do my best, it probably won't be enough. Isabella's hand trembled as she reached for the file. She thought of Clara, safe upstairs, oblivious to the choice being made in this dark office. She thought of the families who'd stood in line with her at the Southside kitchen, the children who'd shared crackers with Clara, the elderly man who'd always let them go ahead of him. If I help you, she said slowly, and if we stop this, what happens to us? Leo's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You become the most important person in my organization. Not my chef, not my employee, my partner in the only thing that matters. Feeding the city. Keeping it alive. He leaned back. But understand this. If you tell anyone who I am, if you expose the funding, Vecchio wins. The politicians will shut down the network to distance themselves from scandal. 3,000 people lose their lifeline overnight. The moral high ground becomes a mass grave. He pushed the intelligence file closer. If you tell anyone who I am, Vecchio wins and the city starves. If you help me stop him, the city eats. The choice is yours. Isabella looked at the file, at the photographs, at the man who'd saved her with one hand while building an empire of violence with the other. The choice wasn't between good and evil. It was between Clara's safety and 800 lives. Between walking away clean and living with blood on her hands either way. She picked up the file. Tell me everything, she said. We have 48 hours. Leo smiled, grim, grateful, and entirely without joy. Welcome to the war. Isabella. The Riverside Charity Kitchen occupied a converted warehouse 6 blocks from the waterfront, its loading docks facing a maze of service alleys that Isabella knew by heart. She'd slept in those alleys during her worst weeks, knew which dumpsters the restaurants emptied first, which corners caught the morning sun, which fire escapes offered shelter from rain. The knowledge had kept her alive then. Now it might keep 800 people breathing. The main entrance funnels through security, Isabella explained, crouched beside Leo in the back of the unmarked van. Marco and 3 other men listened, weapons checked and holstered beneath volunteer vests that matched the kitchen's uniform. But the east loading dock has a service door that's usually propped open during prep hours. Volunteers use it for smoke breaks. No cameras, no checkpoints. Leo studied the building schematic on his tablet. Access to the main kitchen? Through the dry storage room. It's how I'd plant the devices. Maximum structural damage close to the gas lines. She traced the route with her finger. But they need time. The Friday service starts at 6. They'll be in position by 4, latest. The dashboard clock read 3:47. Behind them, Teresa sat with Clara, keeping her distracted with a coloring book. Bringing Clara had been a calculated risk. Leaving her in the penthouse meant leaving her vulnerable if this went wrong, and Teresa refused to let the child out of her sight. Clara had become, in the strange alchemy of crisis, family worth protecting. "We move now," Leo said. Quiet insertion, no alerts. "We identify and neutralize before they can activate anything." They slipped through the service alley like ghosts, Isabella leading them through paths invisible to anyone who hadn't survived on these streets. The east loading dock stood empty, the door propped open exactly as she'd predicted. The smell hit her immediately. Industrial-scale cooking, onions and garlic, and the yeasty warmth of fresh bread. Salvation smelled like comfort food made for hundreds. Inside, the kitchen was controlled chaos. Volunteers in matching vests moved between prep stations, chopping vegetables, stirring massive pots, loading serving trays. Isabella scanned faces, looking for the tells she'd memorized from Leo's surveillance photos. The way Vecchio's men moved too precisely, too aware of their surroundings, eyes tracking exits, instead of focusing on the work. Clara tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, "that man." "What man, baby?" "The one by the walk-in. He has the same backpack." Isabella's blood went cold. "What backpack?" "The green one with the patch. The scary men on Riverside had those. You told me to stay away from them." Isabella followed Clara's gaze. A volunteer near the walk-in freezer was adjusting a military surplus backpack. Olive green, worn, with a faded unit patch that marked it as surplus from Army liquidation sales. The kind of bag bought in bulk from discount stores. The kind of bag that wouldn't look out of place on a dozen men. The kind of bag perfect for carrying things that shouldn't be noticed. "Leo," Isabella breathed. "The backpacks, they're using identical bags to blend in." Leo's hand moved to his concealed weapon. "Marco. Scan for green military surplus bags, that's the marker." They moved deeper into the kitchen, Isabella guiding them through the organized chaos with the confidence of someone who'd worked these serving lines. She spotted the second bag by the gas line junction, exactly where she'd predicted. The man carrying it was pretending to inventory canned goods, but his eyes kept flicking to his watch. Then everything accelerated. One of Vecchio's men made Marco, recognizing him from some past encounter. He shouted, "Security!" and the kitchen erupted. Volunteers scattered, screaming. Isabella grabbed Clara, pushing her toward Teresa. "Get her out! Back door now!" Leo's team engaged, moving with military precision. Gunfire cracked above the industrial ventilation, controlled shots, suppressed, but terrifying in the enclosed space. Isabella ran toward the walk-in freezer where she'd seen the first backpack, knowing the devices were probably synchronized, knowing they had seconds, not minutes. A man stepped into her path, one of Vecchio's soldiers, gun rising. Isabella grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, a large commercial fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. She yanked it free and squeezed the trigger, filling the kitchen with a dense, blinding cloud of chemical fog. The soldier fired wild. Isabella swung the heavy cylinder like a club, connecting with his skull. He dropped. Through the white chaos, she saw Leo moving toward the gas line junction, toward the second bag. But someone else was there. An older man with silver hair and dead eyes. Vecchio. He'd been waiting, watching, ready to activate manually if his men were compromised. Leo and Vecchio collided in violence that was personal, decades of betrayal and power condensed into fists and fury. They crashed into prep stations, scattering vegetables and steel bowls. Vecchio fought with the vicious efficiency of a man who'd survived by being crueler than his enemies. Leo fought with the desperate strength of a man protecting the only good thing he'd ever built. Isabella reached the first backpack, tearing it open with shaking hands. Inside, blocks of C4, a digital timer counting down. 147, 146, 145, and wires color-coded in a pattern she didn't understand. "Marco!" she screamed. "I need help!" Marco appeared through the chemical fog, dropping beside her. His hands moved with trained precision, tracing wires, identifying the primary detonator. "Keep pressure on this wire. Don't let it disconnect." Isabella held the wire while Marco worked, her eyes tracking Leo's fight. Vecchio had a knife now, slashing close. Leo caught his wrist, twisted, and the blade clattered away. But Vecchio was faster, brutal, landing a blow to Leo's ribs that made him stagger. 047. 046. 045. Marco! Almost there. Leo slammed Vecchio against the gas line junction, directly beside the second device. The old man's hand reached for the detonator, fingers closing around it. 023. 022. 021. Done. Marco yanked the final wire. The timer on Isabella's device went dead. Leo saw Vecchio's hand on the second detonator and made his choice. He grabbed the bag and dove, hurling it and Vecchio together toward the loading dock entrance, away from the civilians, away from the gas lines. The device detonated mid-air, a concussive blast that shattered windows and knocked Isabella off her feet. Her ears rang. Smoke filled the kitchen. For a terrible moment, she couldn't see Leo, couldn't see anything but fire and debris. Then he emerged from the smoke, limping, bleeding from a dozen cuts, but alive. Vecchio lay motionless by the loading dock, the blast having taken him at point-blank range. The kitchen was destroyed but standing. The gas lines were intact. The civilian volunteers were shaken but breathing. At 6 p.m., the service doors opened. Families filed in, hundreds of them, unaware that they'd almost died, that a war had been fought in the margins of their hunger. They received their meals with grateful hands, soup and bread and dignity served by volunteers who smiled despite their trembling. Isabella stood beside Leo, watching Clara help Teresa distribute rolls to children who looked just like her. The girl was laughing, innocent, untouched by the violence that had surrounded her. "It's over," Leo said quietly. "No," Isabella replied. "It's just beginning." Because now she understood. This was the price of feeding the city. Not money, not power, but constant vigilance against those who would rather see people starve than let a criminal do good. It was a price she'd learned to pay. The penthouse felt different in the weeks after Riverside. The security remained, the cameras still tracked every corner, but the weight had shifted. Isabella no longer walked these halls as an employee navigating a dangerous employer's moods. She walked them as someone who'd earned her place through blood and choice, through standing in the fire when running would have been easier. Leo called her to his office on a gray morning 3 weeks after the attack. The city sprawled beneath them, indifferent and hungry as always. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, looking more tired than she'd ever seen him. "I'm restructuring Project Solace," he said without preamble. "Vecchio's attack exposed vulnerabilities I can't ignore. The network needs someone who understands both sides, the streets and the operation. Someone the people trust because they've been one of them." Isabella waited, knowing where this was heading. "I want you to manage it. Not the books, not the logistics. Marco handles that. I need you to be the bridge. Visit the sites, talk to the volunteers, identify threats before they become problems. Use your eyes, your instincts, your history." He turned to face her. "You'll have full operational authority. You speak for me in all Solace matters." "I'm not a soldier, Leo." "No. You're something more valuable. You're someone who knows what hunger feels like, who understands what we're actually protecting." He pulled a folder from his desk and handed it to her. "Your official title is Community Liaison Officer, salary, benefits, security clearance. Clara's education is fully funded, private school if you want it, tutors, whatever she needs. You'll have a car, a security detail when you're in the field." Isabella opened the folder, scanning numbers that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. "This is too much." "It's what you're worth." His voice softened. "You saved 800 lives, Isabella. You chose to stand when you could have run. That's not something I can repay with money, but I can make sure you never have to beg for leftovers again." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "And if I want out someday? If Clara and I want a normal life?" Leo was quiet for a long moment. "Then you walk away. I won't stop you. But I think you already know. There's no going back to who you were before. You've seen too much, done too much. The question isn't whether you stay, but what you build with the power you've earned." He was right. She'd crossed a line at Riverside, made choices that couldn't be unmade. But those choices had saved lives, protected the network that fed thousands. If staying in Leo's world meant keeping that network alive, then staying was the only real option. I accept, she said, but I have conditions. Name them. Clara never gets involved in the criminal side. Ever. She volunteers at the kitchens if she wants, but she never learns about the money, the violence, any of it. She gets to be a child. Agreed. And if anything happens to me, you make sure she's taken care of. Not just financially, she gets a real life, away from all this. Leo's expression shifted, something almost paternal crossing his features. Isabella, if anything happens to you, Clara becomes my daughter in every way that matters. She'll be protected, educated, loved. That's not a promise I make lightly. The word loved hung between them, unexpected and true. Somewhere over these months, Clara had stopped being collateral and become family. Leo watched her the way he must have watched his cousin Maria, with fierce, protective attention, trying to save what he'd failed to save before. Then we have a deal, Isabella said. 6 months later, Isabella stood in the Southside Charity Kitchen on a Friday evening, watching the service line stretch around the block. Clara was beside her, wearing a volunteer vest that Teresa had specially tailored to fit her small frame. The girl moved with easy confidence now, chatting with families as she handed out rolls, her smile genuine and unforced. A woman approached with 2 children, exhaustion carved into her face in lines Isabella recognized intimately. The woman whispered her thanks, the kind of quiet gratitude that comes from people who've learned that dignity and desperation aren't mutually exclusive. Clara handed the youngest child, a girl maybe 5 years old, an extra roll, slipping it into her hands like a secret. "This one's special," she said. "It has extra butter." The little girl's face lit up. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. Isabella watched her daughter, this child who'd known hunger and homelessness, now serving others with the kind of grace that came from remembering. Clara had asked months ago why they helped at the kitchen when they had plenty at home. Isabella had told her the truth. Because we were them once. Because nobody should have to beg for leftovers. Leo arrived near the end of service, as he sometimes did, observing from the margins. He never drew attention, never took credit. He just watched the operation he'd built with blood money and desperate hope, making sure it worked, making sure people ate. Isabella joined him by the service entrance, the same door where she'd once stood begging. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3,200 served today, Leo said quietly, across all 12 sites. New record. It's getting colder. More people need help in winter. Then we expand. Open 2 more locations by spring. He glanced at Clara, still smiling as she worked. She's good at this. She remembers what it was like. That's what makes her good. They stood in comfortable silence, watching families leave with full bellies and quiet dignity. Somewhere in the city, Leo's criminal empire continued its operations. The protection, the gambling, the deals that funded every meal served tonight. The contradiction was absolute and undeniable, but so were the 3,000 people who ate because of it. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabella asked. "The choice you made? Building this the way you did?" Leo considered the question. "I regret Maria dying. I regret not seeing her suffer until it was too late. I regret every person I've hurt to build the power that funds this." He looked at Clara again. "But I don't regret feeding them. Even if the cost is my soul, I don't regret keeping them alive." Isabella understood. The leftover food she'd begged for that night at Il Tesoro had never been scraps. It had been the beginning of something larger. A network built on crime but dedicated to mercy, sustained by violence but serving love. It was a contradiction she'd learned to live with. Because at the end of every service, children ate, families survived, and sometimes, survival was the only morality that mattered. Clara ran over, breathless and happy. "Mom, can we come back tomorrow? They need help with the Saturday lunch service." Isabella looked at Leo. He smiled, rare, genuine, and entirely without the darkness that usually shadowed him. "Yes, baby," Isabella said, pulling her daughter close. We'll come back tomorrow and every day after that. Because this was their foundation now, built on blood, yes. Built on crime, absolutely. But also built on the memory of hunger, the choice to help, and the understanding that sometimes the price of feeding the city was everything you had, and still worth paying. Thank you so much for watching this story. If this video touched your heart even a little, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me keep creating stories that inspire, heal, and remind us that kindness still exists in this world.